Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about quality. We're going to be talking about perceptions. We're going to be talking about reality, how our perception of quality fits into reality, and some of the facts about that, like defect rates. What's the average defect rate in America? And sometimes I think our perception of a given situation is actually different than it really is. And, in America, worldwide, there are average defect rates. In the bigger an operation you have, the more complicated that operation is, it affects the defect rates. So auto manufacturers spend a lot of money into trying to produce cars with as few defects as they can, yet, all cars have defects. There's minor defects, and then there's major ones. And so we're going to talk about all of that and how it applies to these knives right here and our buying experience and using experience with these knives. If that would interest you, go ahead and check out the video. Hey, welcome back to the Fortified Castle. What an interesting subject and a dangerous one. And so a lot of guys aren't going to talk about quality because that can be subjective, right? Depending on how we look at a situation. We have different eyes. We have different biases. And so something that bothers one person may not bother another, and vice versa. And so content providers don't talk a lot about quality for that reason. It also could be very upsetting to viewers as you talk about or use an example of a knife in that discussion. So today's video is not really focused on a knife though. So we're not specifically talking about Case or Bear & Son or GEC. We're talking about a broad view and some of the realities about making these knives that exist that we never think about. And I wanted to share that with you because maybe it'll give you a better base to evaluate knives in the future and knives that you have now. And so before we get into that, I want to say hi to all my viewers and thank you. In case you don't watch the end of this video, thank you so much. I really appreciate my viewers. I really, really do. Thank you for all that you do, for the likes, the shares, the comments. It all helps the channel, which helps other people, by the way, have access to this information. So if you found the channel and you liked it, go ahead and share it and help a brother out who's looking for a good channel. And so let's go ahead and get into this. All right, so we are talking about knives, all knives, but I'm a traditional knife guy, and a lot of the stuff we'll talk about will be traditional knives, but also can be applied to modern folders, and we will touch base on modern folders too, talking about quality. So there's 4 knives in front of you. One knife is, I consider this a custom knife. One person made this knife, the whole entire knife. And so traditionally, collectors, people who collect knives, recognize 4 categories, and that is custom knives, which were at the pinnacle, the top of the quality level. Then premium knives. Premium knives are factory-made knives, but they're made to a much higher quality standard. You certainly can see that in this knife right here. And next you had just factory-made knives. So this is a Case. This is an average Case. It's not a premium Case. It's not a collector item. It's just a knife that they made back in 1965 or prior. And average quality goes into these knives. A lot more quality into this knife, which is a premium knife. It was made to be a premium knife. This knife here, collectors consider junk. So you have factory-made knives that are of average or pretty good quality, and then junk knives that were made in a factory, but they were really poor quality knives, and they were made to be cheap, inexpensive, and a knife that vast majority of people could have afforded. And so that has changed today, but traditionally that is the quality levels that collectors looked at. All right, here are 4 knives on the table. They're all factory-made knives, and they're on a table to represent quality traditionally in knife manufacture. So traditionally in knife manufacture, these knives were very good quality. Not necessarily a premium knife. I believe this knife here was probably a premium knife, but the way they made these things were by hand, and if they didn't pass a quality inspection, they were discarded. And so if a blade didn't pass that inspection, they might disassemble the knife and reassemble it with a different blade, but the blade was discarded. Same thing with any defect in the knife. And so largely when you see these knives, they're defect free. They're very high quality because that's the standard of the day. A lot of focus went into the quality of the knife, and there was a lot of competition for these knives. And so even less expensive knives, this is certainly a less expensive knife. It has a fantastic quality of this knife, made in the 60s. But I want to check out the patina on this. It's almost black. Look at that. It's just incredible, the patina on this little K-bar here. Look at that. Anyhow, you know, it was more an ethos or a philosophy putting quality into these knives. This is a Boy Scout knife, and you can see they milled the liners on this, or the divider on this Boy Scout knife. So these were not terribly expensive knives, and you know, designed for boys and sold to boys, and you could just see the quality of this knife is unbelievable. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about past quality standards. I'm just going to tell you, pre-1940, best knives ever made. After 1940, a continual decline in the standard of quality of manufacture of knives. That's just a fact. I've got other videos that walk you through that. I'll put a link in my description about a video on premium knives, what makes a premium knife, and a link to a video on quality of knives. But that's really indisputable. Okay, so what is quality? And quality is a measure of craftsmanship, either perceived, known, or measured. That has to do with the number of defects that you might find in any particular item. And so when you look at a knife, there's things that we look for in that knife, and we have a expectation of a certain level of quality in these knives. And anything less than that is a defect. Now, there are different kind of defects. Like a defect can be a variation in the standard of making something. And so a defect might be if you expect the transitions of this knife to be perfect. If it's raised up at the end and it's not perfect, that's a defect. Now, defects can also affect the function of a knife. And so recently one of the content providers had purchased a knife, and when it was open, it just rattled up and down. It was loose in here. This is a slip joint knife, and so when it slips, that joint slips into the back spring, it's supposed to hold it. Now you can break that, but it's supposed to hold it open. And so a defect in which it rattled around, or if the blade moved side to side aggressively, that would be a defect that affected the function of the item, the thing you're talking about. And so that's a defect that's a mortal defect. In other words, you can't accept that. A gap in the line here, I consider to be defects. Nowadays, it's kind of normal in any company provided knives, but that's a defect, but it doesn't affect the function of this knife. You wouldn't even know it if you weren't looking for it. And so there's two kinds of defects that we see in knives. So the average defect rate in the United States, and probably the whole world, is 4%. That's an average. And what's average? My dad used to tell me if your left foot was in a bucket of ice and your right foot was in a fire, average would be in between. And, you know, what the hell does that mean, Dad? Right? Your dad's always telling you stuff, at least mine did, that I didn't know what he was talking about. But average is in the middle, right? And so you'll have really bad outcomes in knives, and with companies that have a greater defect average, and then you'll have companies that have less. There may even be companies that produce zero defect. So average is all of those added together across, and that's 4%. So you know, what does that look like? Well, with case, that 4% average would produce 48,000 knives a year that are defective or have a defect in them. If you're talking GEC, that 4% rate would give you 1,200 knives that were defective. So this is a GEC here. A lot of people think they're some of the best knives made, and you know, you're still going to have defects in these GEC knives just based on averages. And that's just an industry standard. So the other thing to consider about that, when you think about a 4% defect rate, is that that's going to vary on industry. So some industries are going to have a higher defect rate simply because of what they're producing. For instance, cars, there are thousands of parts on a car, multiple different processes to building a car, multiple different components. They're often parts are built in different areas and then brought together. Very complex building a car. They're going to have a higher defect rate. I do know the auto industry is shooting for a 3% defect rate, and they'd be happy to achieve that. The knife, building a knife like this, a traditional knife, I think Case is saying they have 158 steps that they do now. Back in the 70s, it was 300. At the turn of the century, it was above 300. It was like 368, something like that. So you can see just by those numbers, the industry has tried to cut steps in of making these knives. And it's still a really complicated process to make these knives, and a lot of different parts. If you consider 158 steps to make this knife, each step is a potential area where you could have a defect in the knife. So I would say these are one of the more complicated things to produce. Okay, modern folders, they have actually less parts. There's less to the process of putting these together. And also just the way that these are manufactured are less prone to error. And so the way they put their scales on compared to the way that traditional folders are put on are just easier to do. let me say, and less prone to defects. And so they're just easier to produce. And one of the things you'll notice about modern folders is they have a lot less defects than these traditional folders. It has a lot to do with how these things, they're much simpler to produce. And so it doesn't mean they don't have defects or can't have defects. It just means that they're easier to produce and will have less, probably, defects. Okay, so why don't I take the time to go through all those facts and figures and all those processes and blah, blah, blah. It's to let you know that the reality is that these things are going to have defects, right? It's virtually impossible to produce something when you're producing 1.2 million knives a year not to have defects in those knives. So no matter what company you're looking at, they are going to have defects. Now, some of those defects can be passed through because they're considered not a mortal defect affecting the function of the knife, or it just could be an acceptable defect to the company, right? So they're looking at it and they're saying, okay, most people are going to be okay with this. And so that's really talking about our perception of reality. What am I talking about there? So prior to me collecting knives, when I got a knife, what was important was, does that knife open up and lock properly? Can I resharpen the blade? It would have been nice if it was sharp from the factory, but if it wasn't, can I sharpen it, put an edge on it, and then can I resharpen it? That's the important thing. And the next thing would have been, you know, how durable it is. Is it falling apart on me? Are screws coming out? Is this falling off? Did the blade break when I wasn't abusing it? Those were the type of things that I was concerned about. I would have never, I couldn't tell you if knives had gaps in them. I never looked at that, right? So that's a collector thing. And I never paid attention to whether there were gaps. Now, if there was a big, huge gap in here, I'm sure I would have noticed that. But little tiny gaps like this one right here, which, by the way, is not a gap. It's a differential height in this, some stepping in that. But this knife doesn't have any gaps. It was made by Bear & Son. Pretty cool knife. But anyhow, I just wouldn't have known the difference. And I think most people that use knives are that way. Looking into the top square of this area here, this looks pretty good, but I never looked at this area. I didn't even know it was called the top square until I started collecting knives. And so I think that's where most people are nowadays. And why what I'm telling you is we're hyper attentive as collectors, as knife collectors, to these things, where your average person probably is not, and more concerned about whether this thing falls apart, whether they can sharpen it, whether it opens like it's supposed to and closes like it's supposed to, and that's about it. And as long as the scales don't fall off or the knife come apart, they're going to think the knife is just fine, just great. All right, so some of you already picked up on what I said earlier and are probably screaming at the screen right now. What about quality control? We know they're going to have defects. What about quality control? That's where I'm going next. So something a company should have is good quality control. Some companies do better at that than others. And sometimes it's not so much quality control as what is acceptable by that company. And so when you look at knives, one of the differences that you see in knives is the quality of control that is put into the knife. And so you can have very similar knives, but they can be vastly different because of quality control. And that's kind of one of the primary differences in knives and what makes a good knife and what makes a mediocre knife is the quality control that's put into the knife. This knife right here is a Benchmade. I love Benchmades. A lot of people do. But Benchmade also, over the years, have had a lot of issues with quality control. Also, not really listening to their customers. And so, you know, they've had some issues. But Benchmade is a company that makes around $100 million in revenue a year. And that is puts them in the top 10% in the world of companies. So it's a good company. They produce a good knife, but they have also been lambasted for quality control, and you really don't see that changing very much with the company. And so quality control is a really important issue, and it can vary greatly. But even with a good quality control, you can have defects in the knives. And so I'll give you an example. Bark River. So I love Bark River knives, but you can find videos where guys are pointing out, look, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, these are junk knives. So I watched a video Mike Stewart produced on Bark River's quality control, and there's 5 different steps that receive a look at these knives with quality control in mind, up into packaging. So when they actually package the knife, it's looked at again. But you're dealing with a human being. And so if I have to look at 100 knives a day and package them, I am still liable to miss something and that be passed on, and you as a consumer receive it as a defect in the knife. And so there's still that human error that creeps in under quality control. I think Bark River has exceptional quality control. How many times they look at a knife. I think Case has very poor quality control. So I really question whether they're looking at the knives the way they should be. When you're producing 4,000 knives a day, you know, how closely can you look at those? You could look at every one. You'd have to have the staff to be able to do that. How long does it take to look a knife over? You know, let's say 5 minutes to look a knife over. Multiply that by 4,000. That's a lot of time that's going to take. So what I kind of suspect, I don't know this for certain, but I suspect that Case may look at 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 20 knives that pass through, you know, and a lot of companies do that, right? That's called an example quality control, where you're taking an example of what you're manufacturing and checking it out really close, and if that passes, it's good. But you know, if you're checking 1 out of every 25 knives, there's going to be some slips there. Okay, so I have a large collection of knives, and that collection dates back to the 1840s all the way up to today. 168 different companies, 19 different countries are represented. I think I said that wrong. 168 companies, different companies that produce knives, 19 different countries that these knives are from. And I have a really good representation in the 20th century. So for every 10-year period, I have a lot of knives that represent that 10-year period, plus a variety of companies. And so I can look at these knives and I can see the changes in how they're made and what's standard for a given time period, and what was going on in the knife industry. So why do I tell you that? If you look at these 4 knives here, all of them are actually exceptional knives for this day and age. This is a new one here, Bear & Son. These are phenomenal Barlows. This is a Rough Rider Reserve, and again, made in China, but exceptional quality on this knife. This case knife has no faults. It's a muskrat, and it is just a fantastic knife. It's not the only one. I have a lot of cases that are like this. And then this is a GEC, which is just a fabulous knife. So all of these knives, when I look at them, I base upon my knowledge of how knives were made in history. You know, I have to look at this knife and measure it to what it was. And the reality is, the way they make knives today are totally different. And what I mean by that is, if you look at this knife, it's kind of flat here and squared off. And that's not really how knives were traditionally made. When you look at these bolsters, they're just basically square. And I'm going to show you an example from antiquity. This Wolstingholme, produced in the 1880s probably. If you look at the bolster, how this bolster is rounded over to nothing there, and you see it right here. It's rounded over to nothing. And these knives, you know, just don't compare with the craftsmanship. You can see the difference right there. And now they're really good, but they're not the same. This GEC is probably the closest. You could see they've rounded it over, but it's still kind of flat here. See that? It doesn't merge right into the liner like this one does. And it's this is not an isolated example. So that's just the way knives were made. I'm looking right now. I've already put a knife away that I had. I showed a video the other day. It was the same way. Just absolutely remarkable. And so that's really what I'm talking about. They're cutting steps and producing these knives. Still really good, but they're cutting all kinds of steps, like gluing in shields. All these shields and these vintage knives are penned in. It's a better way to do it. And you know, they're not going to come out. Now, sometimes they break, but it's just a better way to do it, and it takes time, though. And so what we end up with is this right here. It is what it is. And when I look across the company spectrum, I've got 5 GECs. All 5 of them have minor defects and problems. They're not perfect. And I think a lot of people that get these really aren't looking at them close. They just think they're fantastic knives, and they are. But they're not really looking at them close, because that's just, you know, my experience. This one is a fabulous knife here, but it has a few issues with it. And it's the same with most of my knives. They just are not made to the standard that they were years ago. And so really the takeaway from this video is yeah, knives are going to have defects in them nowadays for sure. The quality assurance is just not there. Companies, I don't care what company it is. I don't care whether it's GEC, Case, Rough Rider, Bear & Son, Benchmade. It doesn't matter. They're not going to throw parts away like they used to, and they're going to be more inclined to let defects go through if it's not going to affect the function of the knife. And that's why we get these knives with obvious defects. This Boker right here, all the blades hit. I had to bend these blades to get this thing to even work. And you know, this is a China-made knife, and that's one of the problems I have with Boker, is that I don't think that, you know, they charge $40, $50, $60 for these China-made knives, which is much more than this knife, which is a China-made knife. By the way, this is a very good knife. There are no gapping issues in this knife, and it does have some stepping issues right there. It's a little step. But, you know, they have stepping issues, but not gapping issues. And this is a lot better knife than this knife was right here. Better premium material, and this costs 4 times as much as this knife. And so that's another thing I don't understand, you know, how Boker produces these knives out of China, and they just don't meet the standard of much less expensive knives. So anyhow, I just wanted to give you a foundation. What is a defect? How does the industry look at it? How do they address it? Why we get knives that are defective, and give you some base for you to evaluate your collection with. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found it informative, and thanks so much, guys.